Who's hungry? All right, I'll try to keep this quick, and thank you, Hash, and thank you, Jin, for organizing this. So I want to make this worth it for you before you get to lunch. I'm going to cover three things. The first is the vision and the strategy for Circle. The second, for probably some of the lawyers and builders in the room, how do we think of our regulatory strategy? And then third, next steps. What's coming in terms of the ecosystem? So those are the three things. The first thing in terms of Circle vision and strategy, most of you probably know Circle as an issuer of stablecoin USDC. That's just one part of what we do. We're really a Web3 infrastructure company that has three components, one of which is our stablecoin services, the issuance of the stablecoins. The second piece is our liquidity coverage, where we're working with banks to be able to help our customers to mint and redeem their stablecoin wherever they may be. And then the third piece, which is our newest piece, is our Web3 services. And the Web3 services are essentially the equivalent of Amazon Web Services, AWS, for companies building on Web3. A lot of companies today don't know how to build on Web3, and they don't know how to build on blockchains in particular. So we have products like programmable wallets to help Web2 companies be able to bring that technology natively into the application and not have to think a lot about how to build on the blockchains directly. You don't have to think about the chains. You don't have to think about custody or non-custody. All of that could be taken care of for you. Some new platforms that we will be launching include smart contract platforms and programmable purpose-bound money platforms. So these are additional components to help Web2 companies, traditional companies like e-commerce marketplaces, like digital wallets, that can bring those on and be able to expand into the Web3 space. So that's what we're doing. How do we build our business in a regulatory compliant perspective? Number two. In this part, we are a US-based company. We're headquartered in Boston. We're licensed as a money transmission provider in 46 states. It's not 50 because, as Greg had mentioned, we have complicated laws, and 4 of those states actually doesn't require a license or doesn't have a license for money transmission. So in the states that requires it, we have it. We're also a money transmitter in District of Columbia, DC, as well as in Puerto Rico, some of the territories, which is unique in the United States. In addition to that, we have the first BIT license from the New York Department of Financial Services, New York DFS. And they're probably the most sophisticated virtual asset regulator exist at the state level in the United States. So we have that essentially virtual asset license, the BIT license from New York, plus all of the necessary money transmission licenses across the states. We're also, of course, registered with FinCEN. And I should note that that's important because I used to work at the Treasury. It's really important for anyone dealing with money transmission to be registered with FinCEN. So that's how we're structured in the US, similar to how PayPal and Apple Pay are structured, right? Even these large companies that handle money movement doesn't have any sort of national payment license. They operate generally from a license perspective at the state level. About 2 years ago, we started looking overseas. When we start looking overseas, we start with actually Singapore. We decided that Singapore at the time had probably one of the most advanced regulation in the region. So in November last year, we received what's known as the IPA, the in-principle approval from the MAS, the authorities, under a major payments institution license. In June of this year, we actually converted that from an IPA to a full license, and we can do 3 activities. And where is the colleague from Simmons & Simmons? The first one is DPT, Digital Payment Token Services. So that's the license that everyone that essentially dealing in some sort of digital token have to have. So that category we have. The other 2 are cross-border and domestic money transfer. So there, it's very similar to the US, where you're moving money, you need that particular category of license. So that's what we have in Singapore. We're now setting up our entity and running that, operationalizing that, and hopefully get that running pretty soon. Then, in the rest of Asia, we're looking around. We're taking a peek at Hong Kong, we're taking a peek at Japan, we're trying to get to know different regulators to really understand how they're thinking about the regulatory framework and what is it, how is it that we can operate or our partners can operate in these different jurisdictions. Let's move to Europe. In Europe, in June, they have passed something called MiCA that Thomas had talked about. And there, MiCA is a European Union type framework that covers hundreds of millions of people. The law has been passed, but the rulemaking actually hasn't been done yet. And the rulemaking will probably take another year or so, and probably longer, given that these are Europeans. No offense. But what we did do is we start with a national regulator. And in the case of Europe, we started in France. So in France, there are two licenses that we've applied for. The first is essentially an e-money transmission license. So similar to the US and similar to Singapore, the movement of money, that's the first license. And the second piece is a digital asset service provider, so their version of a virtual asset service provider license. So we believe that with those licenses in France, which is a pretty strong regulator, they're closest. The delta between France and MiCA is probably the smallest, and that France will be our primary regulator in the continental Europe. There's, of course, the UK, which is no longer part of Europe, according to what they've decided to do. And there, we're speaking with the regulators and trying to understand their frameworks. And I think they're probably a little bit behind. They've passed some rules and laws, but I think in the rulemaking part, it's going to take a bit of time. So that's the second part. Third, what's next? Lunch is very soon. On what's next is, for Circle, we are looking to expand all across different regions, working with partners to be able to enable the circulation of USDC, number one. Number two, we're working with Web2 companies to help transition them into Web3. We see huge opportunities there because with the regulatory clarity, a lot of these companies are actually starting to think about how to attack this market. Here in Asia in particular, some of the governments have made Web3 a national competitive strategy. A country like Japan, the LDP party, the ruling party, has a Web3 project team that's set up, hosted by a couple of the legislators, and they're passing laws and regulations to actually clarify taxation and other things, and we expect that to help drive Japan's strategy for Web3. And it's relevant for a place like Korea because there's some similarities in terms of IP-focused industry, things like J-pop and K-pop, gaming. These are things that are very, very similar. They have similar set of user types. And the ability for Korea to compete will actually depend on some of the regulations and the strategy of the government and where they want to take it beyond just normal financial services. I think Caroline Pham spoke about this earlier today, is how to bring Web3 to the rest of the industry. Now, for this industry to succeed, we believe there are three things that has to happen. First and foremost, we need developers. We need builders who know how to build on the Web3 space and the tools to do that. I think Hash and some of the companies that are invested are really focused on that. The second piece is we need to help transition the Web2 companies to Web3, and that's where some of the Circle Web3 services happens. And the third piece is, of course, regulatory clarity. We just saw some of the messy charts and graphs on the screen. What happens when we have regulatory clarity is that crypto moves from a self-referential space to one that can go mainstream. When there's regulatory clarity, listed company and businesses can hold tokens on balance sheet. They know what it means as an asset, as a liability. They know what it means in terms of a recourse on how to address issues and arbitration. So these are what we need in order to propel the industry forward from where we are in a very niche, small space to get to mainstream. So we believe that with developers, with easier services, and then with the regulatory clarity, which all of us are working on, we'll eventually get there. So with that, let me get to lunch.